Well, Art, what a pleasure to have you on campus.
It's likewise, Tim. I've followed you since you were in the legislature, and it's really wonderful to see you taking charge here at Colorado Mesa.
Thank you. Burning question always. Is Good Times really your
In
surname?
Italian, it's Arturo Francisco Bontempi, which means good times. So I use the English. My father's name was Vincenzo on his birth certificate, but he went by Vincent all through his military career and everything. So
Isn't that fast? I wanted to know that.
it sounds like it's a made-up hippie name, and in a way. But as a writer, we all take nom de plumes, So Ferlinghetti, his actual name was, Ferling, and he changed it. A lot of poets and writers and musicians like Bob Dylan changed their names.
Okay.
But in this
bien
case,
tempo.
Yeah, bien tempo is buon tempi, but it means good time. So why not use English?
I like it.
We speak English.
And as a person who was in public service, that's the perfect name, right? Because everybody remembers it.
Well, it was great for my re-election campaigns. More good times.
Knitting, it was always fascinating, and I think it's interesting that you used to knit. I'd see you at Club 20 meetings, and you're sitting there knitting away, and nobody thinks you're paying attention, and all of a sudden, you look up and engage in the conversation as it's going. And so, was there a strategy to that, or is it just?
There's a lot of strategy in the theater of politics that I was participating in as I'm a minority. I'm on the left. This is a very conservative area. I'm dealing with people who have very different views than I do. And I come from the city. I'm not a rural kid, so I'm, a city person who's learned to love the rural, but that's a different kind of space. I mean, honestly, I think the biggest divide I saw in Colorado in politics was rural and city, even more so than the different parties, because people on our side of the divide, water is so precious that we want to know every drop, how it's going, what it's being used for, and we try to conserve as much as we can. And the cities are concerned about different things. I think gun control, I think, is a good idea in the cities. I don't think it's a good idea in the rural areas. But again, it's hard to make those kinds of differential changes in politics and still appeal to a broad mass of folks.
It's interesting. Do you think, I remember in my day, it was sort of the Cowboy Caucus or whatever it was, but it was always kind of rural Colorado, and so whether Western or Eastern Plains or Southern, that we would always try to give a nod to one another, realizing we were in a minority within a broader body defined by political party. But I don't see that affinity much anymore with rural, and I see more loyalty to party. Do you see that?
Yeah, I do too. I remember when I was in politics, and I've been out a couple years now, but in the 90s, I started, there was somebody ran for a House seat here, and somebody asked her at Club 20, if it came up, would you do what you promised to tell the people, or would you do what the party wanted you to do? And she said, "Well, I do what the party wants me to do."
Yeah, I see, and you see that on both sides.
Both sides.
You go, really? Party over region? I don't know.
No, it's people first, and that's what I do say. I really learned. Even my most conservative friends. I remember one time in Colorado counties, the organization, statewide organization, there was a commissioner from El Paso County who. Their districts are huge. They're commissioner districts. And they're as big as counties. And so she wanted to exempt her commissioner district from planning. And she said the people in her district wanted that. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm agreeing. Grassroots democracy is what I believe in. Sure, I'll support you. So it was her and I against everybody else, Democrat, Republican. They all thought we were nuts. And I'm like, no, we should give as much power to the local control as people want. If they don't want planning, then they should do it.
And they just...
But so many people are ideological about strategies to get to goals.
Right.
So when we're talking about freedoms, I'm very insistent. If the government... I was very, very disappointed with when we have rent control, when we have deed-restricted homes. It got to be so if someone had a sick parent, they had to go home to back east or something. If they wanted to go to school, they had to come to the government and get permission to do it because they were in a deed-restricted unit, and even if they owned it, they still had to live and work in that county. And it was like, I didn't like government intruding that way on people's private rights.
See, but don't you think that's interesting? And I found that, and I'm not sure I'm seeing it or that people recognize where right means left. And I'm talking about the political spectrum where all of a sudden, and it really becomes, and some people call it, okay, I'm a social liberal, and some people say, actually, I'm just very conservative or libertarian. I just want the government to stay the heck out of my life.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting
Well,
when that connects.
it's interesting looking for me on history because I was trained as a Roman Catholic seminarian. I studied history, Latin and Greek, and all. The sources of Western civilization, and I really seems like what the Chinese, as I understand it, the heroes of the Chinese were people who fought for empire. And the heroes in our culture are those who revolt against empire. So it's a very interesting difference. We tend to be revolutionary in our thinking. Jefferson kind of encouraged this kind of thinking. And yet, when you go back in time, if you read the Three Kingdoms, that Chinese romance, the heroes there are the people who fought to keep the emperor in place. And why was that? It was because without centralized control, it was chaos in the countryside, and everybody suffered. And so when you had revolutionary movements, no matter how appropriate, they often led to the peasants being the ones who paid the dearly
Right.
for all of that. So it's really been an eye-opener to me to see, it's made me aware of how important it is, no matter what side we come from, to defend the system that we have. Imperfect as it may be, we may have had goals that we couldn't attain in the beginning, we're only now beginning to attain, but you know what? Imperfect as it is, it's a great vision. And I just love the fact that if we could work together, I always like to say, a bird takes both wings. You can't have just left wing. You can't have just right wing. A bird takes two wings.
I will use that
It
quote.
takes two
That's
wings
good.
to fly, so I need both of them. I want to hear why. For the longest time, I thought my friends in Rio Blanco, there was one commissioner I really liked. He was a character. He was sexist, and he was probably racist. I never got that, but he certainly was sexist, and he smoked like a chimney, but he was a great character, and I never could understand why he was so supportive of oil and gas. He was like carte blanche, everything oil and gas wanted. And then I found out through talking that 60% of his budget in the county was
driven
oil and
by-
gas money. If he didn't defend oil and gas, he was going to have to lay off maybe half of the people in the courthouse. Well, wait a minute. I understand now. I may not agree, but I understand.
And if you'd been in that juxtaposition, maybe
I would have maybe done the same.
or similar.
Or similar.
Yeah.
So it's when we humanize these issues and make them people, and when we understand what the people want, then you can say, okay, well, I'd like to transition us away. It's like you're saying with the coal. I don't want to abandon infrastructure that leaves all these people out of work. Let's figure out a transition that can make it work. So yes, we sort of need to move away from coal, but we can't just stop.
We need energy. That's exactly. We were talking about Craig and what to do with
Yeah.
those power plants,
Yeah.
and there is that group that says shut them down, dismantle them,
Yeah,
all over.
all over.
And the answer to me, as we just alluded to, is you still need the power, and you have all this infrastructure there. It's insanity.
It's insanity.
Just to shut it down instead of, as you said, now, at some point, sustainables or renewables or whatever you want to call them will get there, battery storage,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. We need to move in that direction, but let's do it in an orderly way, and let's have as few victims of the transition as
Well,
possible.
and those people up there, I tell you, that's going to be a very raucous debate because it'll be shut out the lights, last one to leave, if they just completely shut those down.
Yeah, that's tough.
So, what brings you down to Grand Junction?
Oh,
and
well,
to CMU?
poetry. So poetry's that's my life. I've always been a poet, and that's been. I was a street poet in San Francisco, so we do poetry out on the street. I used to work at a preschool, and during the day I'd get a long strip of butcher paper, have the kids draw on it. I'd write some poetry, they'd draw on it, and then we'd take it down and tape it on the stairs of the library and Civic Center in San Francisco, and then read Neruda and Whitman to passing citizens. It was fun.
I wish I went and watched you as you were talking to one of our classes and we're reading some of your poetry. And you are a performance poet. And I don't know how to describe that other than you're reading a poem that you about Alaska
Mhm.
and bears and walking around, and we've all done that, where you're
That's
just
right.
sure that. But I was you were reading and I was watching the students, and you went to your knees at one point in fear as you were reading that passage, and the students' reaction was sort of between shocked and amused and engaged. It was just amazing.
Well, that was when I say theater in politics. For me, one of the first things one of my advisors, who was a older gentleman than myself, he said, Art, you're gonna have to shave and cut your hair if you want to run. And I said, no, no, I'm gonna be who I am. I'm not gonna change. What I understand from moving into a redneck area and being a kind of intellectual dude was that if I showed fear, if I pretended I was something I wasn't, people could smell it.
Oh yeah.
They know right away. If I told them who I was and agreed to disagree and wasn't a bad person, I was accepted. So I've been able to live in a very conservative community and have many friends. Some people didn't like me, but that's okay. We don't like everyone. It's not a bad thing. In Norwood, I knew people who didn't like me right up front. And tell you right, you never know.
In Grand Junction, I know people who don't like me as well, right up front.
It's wonderful to live in rural Colorado. In rural California, where my family goes back 7 generations, they the people there. I think a lot of folks came across the country, and on the way across, they were attacked. They went through great hardship, and when they came to California and Oregon, they were pretty hard bitten. They were tough people, and they weren't real friendly. And so a lot of rural California was really unfriendly, especially if you're like me and you look like a wild hippie. So it made it sort of unpleasant. Yet when I came out here to Colorado, I would stop on the side of the road. I'd break down. Some redneck would pull up. They'd get out their tools. They'd change my tire. They'd fix everything for me. They wouldn't charge us a penny, and it was that kind of generosity that was irregardless of political views. It was just about human. And I love that about rural Colorado. I've learned to really, I feel like my neck is getting redder all the time.
What brought you to Colorado from California?
Well, I was part of the bioregional movement. We were interested, Planet Drum Foundation, really interested in trying to re-inhabit, we called it, natural areas. And again, the natural world. I remember being at a conference on poetry. It was called Left Right, WRITE,
Okay.
Left Right, and it was a very interesting gathering. It was half the people in the hall were personal liberationists, gays and lesbians, and they were saying, until we work out individual relationships, politics, we're not going to get anywhere. And the other side of the room was Marxist Leninists, and they were all, until we have the class solution and we change capitalism, we're not going to. And there were a few of us in the back of the room saying, well, where does nature fit in here? The natural world is all what we live off of, no matter what system you're under. And so for those of us that felt like that, when we learned about deep ecology and Dolores LaChapelle's work and Duvall and some of the others, it really opened us to another pathway, that there's a way forward that maybe one of the solutions to energy, and no one solution is going to do it, one of them is reducing our use of energy. One of the things we need to focus on is our own personal use. And how can we, make it less? How can we make the transition? How can we be sure that people that are involved in the traditional industries aren't terribly hurt, aren't crushed by the changes? I mean, these are all aspects that you don't get if you're on one side of the table and you're only listening to your side. If I'm on a table and it's the public land partnership was a great example
Yeah.
in Montrose Delta. Here it was, we are, Telluride, Aspen, the elites, counties, we think of ourselves as intellectually superior to everybody else. And who was it that reached out to make collaboration? It was Delta Montrose, two of our more conservative counties. They formed a partnership to sit down and talk about issues. We started to form what I like to call a table of trust. You can't really work with people if you don't trust them. And I didn't trust the lumber person. I thought they were lying, of course. And I learned after years of sitting at a table that no, they were telling exactly the truth as they understood it and what they saw. And if I wasn't listening to them, I wasn't paying attention.
But don't you think I always learn as you get to know people, then you appreciate that their perspective, people you serve with, people I serve with, and you realize you might disagree, and it isn't because they're you're right, they're wrong, you're good, they're bad. It is just that you have different perspectives.
Yeah.
And at some point, you can. I was intrigued with your discussion today about compromise and the Latin meaning of compromise. You should share that. That's a
Oh
very
well,
interesting.
again, because I had luckily I studied Latin and Greek, I got a good grounding because so much of English comes from those sources. And we think of compromise; it has sort of a negative spin these days. If we compromise, we have sold out our values. That's the connotation that's come around. Words are clouds of meaning. They have all kinds of energy around them, and compromise has become sort of a bad word. But as an Earth Firster, I was their poetry editor for the Earth First Journal. Our motto was no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. Well, that's noble, isn't it? We are totally on the side of the natural world. That's great, isn't it? Well, not really, because compromise comes from the Latin mittere, to send, com, with, and pro, towards. Compromise. So we're sending something forward with the help of others. That's our political system. If you say no compromise, you're saying, I'm right, you're wrong, it's end of story. And that's not the end of the story. That's a bad way to end. We need to work together to figure out pathways to move forward. Okay, we have to be careful. We do need to have an Endangered Species Act. But do we need to have an Endangered Species Act that bankrupts whole communities? How can we balance making it sustainable for people as well as the environment? People say nature and they think of it as something out there. That's us. We're nature.
We're part of
We're part of it.
mankind is certainly
Everything
part of
is
nature.
organic
That's
chemistry.
exactly.
Everything's organic, really.
So you studied to be a priest,
Yeah.
and then didn't enter the priesthood.
No, I didn't get tonsured. It's a kind of medieval system. There's 6 years of minor and 6 years of major seminary, and I was in the minor seminary for 1 year in the major. But in the you have 4 years. Basically, it's like 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, and 4 years of post grad work. That was the old model. Now people don't usually enter so young. We were 14 when we started, so it was pretty young.
Oh goodness, really?
And it was I have a book that somebody wrote about the seminary I went to, and it's all about the rule, and it was kind of a Spartan lifestyle. It was kind of medieval. The Sulpicians were our teachers, not Jesuits. Jesuits are intellectually pretty sharp. Sulpicians were Jansenists, which was the Catholic kind of cult of puritanical kind of measure. We only were allowed to listen to classical music, and we could only read books that had been stamped with a permission, an imprimatur, they called it.
Really?
It was a very, when I started, medieval. And then the Vatican Council happened, and it all started to change. But when I was there, it was very much still almost a medieval kind of cloistered life.
So what parts of that carry forward in you today, do you think?
Well, I think, that stepping outside of our dog-eat-dog culture, which if you go into Robert Bly talks about the three brains, and I think that's a good analogy. I don't think it's necessarily physically exactly right, but we sort of have an old lizard limbic brain that is instinctual. Fight or flight or freeze. People forget about freeze. If you're a deer, you don't run, you don't fight, you freeze, and you just don't move for a while. So I think there's fight, flight, or freeze, and we have those instincts in us. So when danger comes, we might take one of those pathways. Then we have the cortex, which is sort of the animal brain, and our nurturing and our loving, and the energy we have for others. And then we have the neocortex, which is analytical and scientific and is testing all the time. It's a scientific process. We're doubting, we're looking, we're making guesses. So the three brains all operate in our lives, but it seems like in business, the world that my dad was a subcontractor in California, and I saw the construction world as very much a dog-eat-dog kind of world. It was very instinctual. You underbid people when you could. You took advantage of every opportunity to get a contract. All that kind of stuff. And it wasn't mean always, but it was sometimes very soft. But it was very much that kind of a place. Well, to jump from that, to skip the animal, to skip the relationship learning you have in high school, in colleges, where you get to have intimate relations with all kinds of different people, when then you try to jump to the neocortex and you try to get into the spiritual, analytical mind, that was too big a jump. the way the Roman Catholics do it, you have to be celibate, and that's just not feasible for young people of either sex, I don't think. When you're young, it's really hard to do that. I mean, some people it works, but as you get older, I love living alone right now. It's really wonderful. I have so much freedom. I'm a widower, so my wife has passed, so I have the freedom to do a lot of things that I wouldn't have otherwise. But I can go into the neocortex. I can go into the spiritual. I can inhabit a place of Spartan, powerful will that I wouldn't be able to do if I was in the animal, nurturing, taking care of children kind of phase. So to leap for me to go from the lizard world into the spirit world was pretty hard.
But you carry any of that education?
Well,
and
that's what
training?
happens. You still carry that desire for
Right.
the spiritual. I think there's an ethical kind of power. You know, as much as I'm not a Christian myself right now. I'm not a follower of Christ. I have great respect for the Christian ethos, and I love a lot of what Pope Francis has done, and I follow. From a distance, I follow the church just to see what changes they are making in art. I think it built a desire for the spiritual that I wouldn't have had if I came from lower middle class folks. Nobody went to college in my family. I was the first, and
Huh.
it was really a great leap. So I think if I hadn't had that push, I may not have gotten beyond anything.
You got into a little discussion today with the class, and it's an interesting connection to what we're seeing on college campuses, and not all college campuses, but it is when you have a speaker who is going to approach something from one end of the political spectrum or another, or has a point of view that many disagree with on the campus, that there is this movement to say, no, we aren't going to have that speaker here. We had someone here who was very much of a global warming denier, or whatever you want to call it. And it was intriguing to me that we had some faculty encouraging their students to reach out to my office and others and say, no, we cannot have this person. Rewarding to me was to say to those students, no, if you need to go listen to him, and he might have some points that are valid, or he might have points that reaffirm your belief in what you believe. But you had that discussion with students today, and I think it was an interesting take.
Well, I like to bring that up because I come from the left, and I understand the passion and the energy that people have invested in trying to make things right. But my teacher was really insistent that, like Krishnamurti says, you can have knowledge of the range of possibilities of the future, but you shouldn't have an expectation of what's going to happen. If you're already expecting that you're going to be angry, and you're going to be angry, you're not going to listen, you're not going to hear anything. I've always felt in my life I've learned the most by listening to everyone. And then I get to make my own decisions. What's wrong with having somebody come, no matter what they say, if they're going to stimulate some discussion? Have a discussion group around it, but not allowing people on campus. I find that really difficult. That's really hard for me.
And you asked about the Civic Forum, and you probably remember Bob Silbernagle, who wrote for the
I
Grand
love
Junction
Bob, you bet.
Daily Sentinel. And so Bob wrote me a note and said, you know what, I really would like to see us at Colorado Mesa set up a civic forum where we can bring two people with opposing viewpoints and try to have a discussion, or have somebody, on a topic that's poignant at the time. And so that's really the purpose of the civic forum.
I think that's wonderful. We need, so again, what I really realized after working for 10, 15 years with the Public Lands Partnership under the direction of Mary Chapman, who is celebrating her 40th wedding anniversary with Steve Schrock tomorrow, or Friday, I think. Tomorrow, I'm going to go visit their anniversary. I became good friends with people that were very different than me, but I think what I learned from that was that unless you have these tables of trust, unless you have places where people can come and know they're not going to get shouted down. It was funny because when I first got elected, I made a point of becoming a member of what we called Club 20. I guess it's changed a bit, but it was most of the counties on the Western Slope. And what an eye-opener it was for me to go, because I was a member of the Western Colorado Congress. I had been at the very beginning of that group. And I was always disappointed that it wasn't a Congress. They had spotty representation around different spots on the slope, but it wasn't a Congress at all. And yet, Club 20, a private club, was a Congress. They had representation of club members in every county that they participated in. So then when I would argue at a forum and say, I want, more solar, more wind, I would be talking to 20 people. Two of us would be in support and 20 would be opposed. And so I had to make a point, and they were hostile, but not mean, not uncivil, but they were not friendly. I had to make my argument all the stronger. I had to understand and make my points, and I had to answer all their questions. I thought that was a wonderful process. No, I wasn't the winner, but what I found was in the theatrics of politics, I was represented something very different. I look different. I act different. I weave while I'm in meetings, but I'm very attentive and I bring up new things. I love what the Quivira Coalition down in New Mexico calls the radical center. I like the radical middle as a word better because I don't think there's any one spot. It's just the sort of muddle that goes back and forth. But I find myself siding with this conservative El Paso commissioner because she wanted to give her citizens complete local control. I was all for local control. I think that's right. We need more, not so much control, but buy-in, especially with all these federal agencies.
Oof.
Oh my goodness, it's changing. One administration does one thing, the next does the opposite, and those of us caught on the bottom we're seesawed back and forth.
You get whiplash, don't you?
All the time.
What's the policy?
And if you're in business, it doesn't matter so much what the policy is as security, knowing what it is.
Let me adapt to it, and I can work with it exactly.
Exactly. If it's onerous, I'll tell you. But if it's reasonable, well, let's work with it. And that's why you find emission controls in California, people wanting to set it up on a lower rate than the feds now. I mean, it used to be the feds were leading, and now it's the states that are. For local government, which I think is the government that really works, once you have a table of trust, once you start working with people on the other side of the table with different viewpoints, and you don't agree with them, but you trust them, and you know what they're representing their people, and they're trying to do as best a job for all good reasons, maybe not the same, but good reasons. I think that's the way government really works best. And then we come up with compromises that work for everyone.
And at the end of the day, whatever the decision is, that's the decision. Let's move forward.
Exactly. It was funny on Club 20 one time. I got upset with some of the oil and gas folks because they would play dirty. I mean, they knew how to play the game, so you'd spend weeks in committee working on a document. And I remember working with this one industry woman from Denver, a lawyer. She was wonderful. We worked and worked and worked and got to a place where we both could agree. Neither one of us liked it, but we both could agree on this issue. Brought it to the full body, and they tried to take it out on the floor because they had more people that they could call on that would vote whatever way they wanted.
And they were ready for you.
And they were ready for us. And so I couldn't believe it, but the industry woman stood up for the compromise that we did.
Which she should.
Which she should.
When you reach a compromise, I think you're bound to defend that.
And when I defended it, she defended it, and we had built a table of trust. That to me was more important than any issue that came up.
See, but I was going to say to you, because you talked about being in Club 20 and you didn't win much, but the win comes in changing the debate and altering by degrees. Sometimes you just get a little bit, and unfortunately my perspective of what's happening in Denver and D.C. is it's all. It's not, well, we could give you ground 5, 10, 15%, and I can get 85%, 75%. No, I want 100. And that's a problem.
It's that we want it all. It's never enough, and it's unfortunate because of the way the two-party system has worked out, and it's been with us forever. So, being part of a minority party, I was disappointed that the minority party was as unreasonable as the major parties. They didn't want to compromise. It's no system is perfect, and certainly the parliamentary system has its drawbacks. But when you have to align with different sides, I think there's some value in that, in trying to come up with governments that then reach out to more of the citizens. Then, now we have a government that answers to 20, 30, 40% of the people, and it's as if they don't care if there's anybody else. And that wasn't the way I understood politics when I was growing up.
So I think you are the only Green Party member to hold office in the state of Colorado, local, state.
I think there was a couple non-partisan municipal elected officials, but nobody. Again, people forget the Greens run national and state candidates, and I've always been opposed to that. I said, it's not appropriate. I'm not going to vote for some Green Party hack who has no experience for Attorney General. No way. I'm going to vote for somebody who has experience. Now, Democrat, Republican, I may vote either way, probably Democrat, but there's been Republicans I've supported. Don Coram is a Republican I've supported in my area. I like Don. He makes decisions based on, not on the party. He's bucked his party on occasion when he has to, but he's a party guy, but he will buck it if he feels like it's important. And I love that about him. And so I supported him. And I'm proud to do that. And I think that's the thing, is we need to get away from it's almost like the partisan thing is really hurting us.
I think clearly, and I think the electorate, I think we're all just tired, sick to death of it, quite frankly. But so I think last question for you, and you talked a lot about your writing style and all those sorts of things, and listening to your poems. I would wonder, because I think we're going to have you back and try and have a debate on a topic and have you participate, because I think that would be a great piece of the Civic Forum. But hopefully when you come back, you'll come back with a poem dedicated to Colorado Mesa University.
I would be happy to.
But I know that it has to kind of spring from the wherever. So if you can do that, we would love to hear it.
I would love to do that. I have a poem about hunting that might be an appropriate ending if you
Go
like
ahead.
that.
Yes.
Yeah, because when I came here, I came from the city, and I've been a vegetarian for times, and then I've learned when I was in Montana as a Vista volunteer, we went out with the Crow people and shot an elk, and they cut open the elk, and they pulled out the liver, and they gave it to us to eat. And it was
raw, right?
Raw, and it was a powerful communion, a spirit kind of, and it kind of inspired this poem. There's a whole lot of life in these animals. George nods almost like a prayer as I hold the hoofed leg steady for the knife. Mist rises from the gutted belly, skin still warm. Tempered steel peels back, thick hide, fur, the dark meat of the interior. Secret organ slides steaming into full moonlight on the bed of Greenbank's battered pickup. I can't stop peering into the glazed crystal of those antlered eyes, two perfect rivets welded to the girder of that skeletal moment when the bullet's magic cut life short. Later, after the carcass is hung in a cottonwood tree, I go inside to wash my hands. But the blood won't come off. And there's no mistake. I am marked for life. I wear the elk's tattoo as its meat becomes my meat and its blood stains my blood. Spirit leaping from shape to shape.
There's Art Bien Tiempo, Art Goodtimes, right? In persona. Thank you.
Thank you
so
Tim.
very much.
It's a pleasure.
And we'll have you back.
I'd love that.